The conversation ran on numerous topics. He had just received a pamphlet published by one of our astronomers, Mr. G, in which Sir John Herschel is attacked. This he regretted, and made some remarks on favorable opinion of Herschel had always had of America and her scientific men. He inquired with interest after Mr. Bash and his progress towards the survey of our coasts, and seemed quite familiar with the state of policy his appointment had produced among the gentlemen of the Navy. The Navy officers always object to an appointment of that kind when not made from their own number. Not matter how competent and efficient the person may be. Speaking of Professor Agrasius, he said, "You Americans have made a fine acquisition there. Agassiz would be distinguished even in Europe for his attainments in various branches of natural history. Perhaps he is a little too unbending in his theory of the effect of glaciers on the change of the general climate of the world. However, he has thrown a great deal of light on that subject, having made personally many very excellent experiments and observations. The mention of glaciers led naturally to that of persons who have explored them, and of exploring voyages to the north. One of us asked his opinions as to the fate of Franklin. He thought it quite probable that Franklin had not perished, but was still shut in by the ice, and gave several facts of voyagers whom he had seen, and whom he had been for a long season so detained in northern seas. The Esquimaux of the coast, he said, were not all that dangerous. Franklin has well supplied with provisions and would probably yet return to give an account of his voyage. Indeed, the report that the Esquimaux Indians had said that some vessels had long been frozen fast in the ice, away off to the north, seemed to be fully confirmed. He praised the United States for its generous initiative in matters of science, and said that the expedition to Chile for scientific purposes would not have been undertaken by any country in Europe. He had been on his desk near him a letter which he had apparently been reading when he came in. His eyes failing on it, he asked, "Do either of you know Lord K, who is now traveling on the continent?" On the reply that we had not the honor of his lordship's acquaintance, and indeed had never heard of him, he said that he had just received the most extraordinary letter from him. He writes me from Dresden that he will shortly be in Berlin, and will be most happy to make my acquaintance, and that I certainly dine with him and a few friends at 2 o'clock on the 3rd at the British Hotel. He expects an old man like me to come from Potsdam in the middle of winter to dine with a lord whom I know nothing about. This is one of the antics of an eccentric class. He then went on in some gay and delicately humored remarks on the eccentricity of Englishmen, which, if I could put them on paper, as he uttered them, would be read with great relish by the lovers of true wit, and by none more than the English themselves. They reminded me of the lively sallies of the Parisian wit, Philorente Chasles. One of us told them that Captain Stone had left for Egypt and Jerusalem. Mr. Humboldt expressed the pleasure he had derived from this acquaintance, and wished to know whether the captain was aware that he had put his name in the last volume of the recent edition of the work, The Aspects of Nature. This is in connection with the account of the captain's visit to Patel. He then showed us the English translations of this work by Mrs. Sabine. The name of Colonel Fremont happening to be mentioned, Humboldt spoke in high praise of his contributions to geographical science and thought it unfortunate he had returned as a prisoner by the very road he had traveled as an explorer. He thought that the day would better come when Colonel Freeman's work would be much better appreciated than at present. He then expressed the opinion that the provable produce of the California coal mines had been overestimated, for that up to the present time the yield had been much less than that of the Russian mines, the latter having often produced annually $30 millions. No such large pieces have been found in California. One solid piece of 80 pounds had been found in Russia, and many of 40, 30, 20, and 16. He was surprised that no platina had been found. There are only a few of these remarks made in a conversation which he, of course, conducted almost without remarks on our side. He seems to have an exhaustible store of facts, and to be accurately informed about everything and everybody. His friend said after he came away that the way to hear him to the greatest advantage was to ask his opinion on any given point, when his wonderful knowledge would be brought to bear upon it in a manner most satisfactory to any skeptic, as to hear the extent and minuteness of his information. We left quite charmed with the noble and genial nature whose richness has made it to the glory of the age. The habits of Humboldt are not remarkable, except in the limited number of hours necessary to sleep, and in temperance and regularity. His time is systematically divided. He rises at 6 in the winter and 5 in the summer, studies 2 hours, drinks a cup of coffee, returns to his studies, and commences to the task of answering his letters, of which he receives yearly more than 100,000. I have heard this number doubles, but dislike to seem to exaggerate. From 12 until 2 he receives visits and returns to work at 2. At 4 he dines in summer with the king, in winter at home. From 4 until 11 he passes at the table, and generally in company with the king, but sometimes at the meetings of learned societies, or in the company of his friends. At 11 he retires to his studies and continues there until 1 or 2, answering letters or writing his books, or preparing them by study. His best books have all been written at midnight. He sleeps 4 hours, it having been a peculiarity in his family to require little sleep. Now, if anybody thinks that by sleeping only for 4 hours and studying at midnight, he may be equal to Humboldt in varied attainments, let him first be sure that he possesses another of Humboldt's peculiarities, namely genius. His early inclinations led him to the pursuits in which he had hence so distinguished himself. At 23 he was in such a repute for his knowledge that he was appointed the first successor of the mines of Prussia from a very early age. Then up to the present time, about 2/3 of a century, he had been indefatigable in the pursuit of knowledge. He had brought to his pursuit a rare susceptibility to the charms of nature, a heart capable of feeling, and a head of generalizing. His fortune and rank have ever been given to him the best advantage of any kind. If he had not been a savant, he might have been an artist or a poet, for his works show taste and imagination of the most exquisite perfection. Most of his writings will compare in elegance with that of the purest classics of Germany. In short, he is one of the most harmoniously developed characters the world has ever seen. and posterity will reserve for him a higher niche in the Temple of Fame than for bloody heroes who have dazzled the world for a moment by their engineer talent of maneuvering masses of troops. Some years later, there came to Berlin a young American traveler who, younger than Humboldt, when he made his great American journey, had already traveled extensively in 4 continents and written several books of travel, which the world had pronounced unequaled of their kind. He lacked Humboldt's universal knowledge of science, for what traveler, ancient or modern, ever possessed it? But in the word paintings and the power of making the landscape that he had seen glow on the pages as on a painter's canvas, he had no need to fear a comparison with that great master of the picturesque. For his early youth he had venerated the name of Humboldt, and being in Germany, he had made a pilgrimage to Berlin to see him. The homage that he brought to the great traveler was unlike honorable to both. It becomes youth to reverence age, and it becomes age to accept the reverence of youth. I came to Berlin, says Bayard Taylor, writing from that city, under the date of November the 25th, 1856. I came to Berlin not to visit its museums and galleries, its magnificent street of lindens, its operas and theaters, nor to mingle in the gay life of its streets and its saloons, but for the sake of seeing and speaking with the world's greatest living man, Alexander von Humboldt. At present, with his great age and his universal renown, regarded as a throned monarch in the world of science, his friends have been obliged perforce to protect him from the exhaustive language of the thousands of subjects, and for his own sake to make difficult the ways of access to him. The friend and familiar companion of the king, he may be said equally to hold his court with the privilege, however, of at any time breaking through the formalities which only self-defense has rendered necessary. Some of my words I know had found their way into his hands. I was at the beginning of a journey which had probably led through regions which his feet had traveled and his genius illustrated, and it was not merely a natural curiosity which attracted me towards him. I followed the advice of some German friends and made use of no mediatory influence, but simply dispatched note to him, stating my name and object, and asking for an interview. 3 days afterwards, I received through the city post a reply in his own hand, stating that although he was suffering from a cold, which had followed his removal from Potsdam to the capital, he would willingly receive me and appointed me 1 o'clock today for the visit. I was punctual to the minute and reached his residence in the Oranienburger Strasse as the clock struck. As Berlin, he lives with his servant, Safet, whose name only I found on the door. It was a plain 2-story house with a dull pink front, and inhabited, like most of the houses in German cities, by 2 or 3 families. The bell wire over Safet's name came from the 2nd story. I pulled the heavy porticoche opened of itself, and I mounted the steps until I reached a 2nd bell pull, over a plate inscribed Alexander von Humboldt. A stout, square-faced man of about 50, whom I once recognized as Safet, opened the door for me. "Are you Herr Taylor?" he asked, and added on receiving my reply, "His Excellency is ready to receive you." He ushered me into a room filled with stuffed birds and other objects of natural history. then into a large library which apparently contained the gifts of authors, artists, and men of science. I walked between two large tables heaped with sumptuous folios to the further door which opened into the study. Those who had seen the admirable colored lithograph of Hildebrand's picture know precisely how the room looks. There was the plain table, the writing desk covered with letters and manuscripts, the little green sofa, and the same maps and pictures on the drab-colored walls. The picture had seen so long hanging in my own room at home that I had once recognized each particular object. Seifert went into an inner door, announced my name, and Humboldt immediately appeared. He came up to me with a heartiness and cordiality which made me feel that I was in the presence of a friend, gave me his hand, and inquired whether we should converse in English or German. Your letter, said he, was that of German, and you must speak the language familiarly. But I am also in the constant habit of using English. He insisted on my taking one end of the green sofa, observing that he rarely sat upon it himself. Then he drew up a plain cane-bottomed chair and seated himself beside it, asking me to speak a little louder than usual, as his hearing was not so acute as formerly. As I looked to the majestic old man, the line of Tennyson describing Wellington came into my mind. O good grey beard head, which all men know. The first impression made by Humboldt's face and that of a broad and genial humanity, his massive brow heavy with the gathered wisdom of nearly a century, bends forward and overhangs his breast like a ripe ear of corn. But as you look below it, a pair of clear blue eyes, almost as bright and steady as a child's, meet your own. In those eyes you read that trust in man, that immortal youth of the heart which makes the snows of 87 winters lie so lightly upon his head. You trust him utterly at the first glance, and you feel that he will trust you if you are worthy of it. I had approached him with a natural feeling of reverence, but in 5 minutes I found that I loved him and could not talk with him as freely as with a friend of my own age. His nose, mouth, and chin have the hairy Teutonic character, whose genuine type always expresses an honest simplicity and directness. I was surprised by the youthful character of his face. I knew that he had been frequently indisposed during the present year, and had been told that he was beginning to show the marks of extreme age. But I should not have suspected him of being over 75. His wrinkles were few and small, and his skin was smoothest and delicacy rarely seen in old men. His hair, although snow white, is still abundant. His step slow but firm, and his manner active almost to restlessness. He sleeps but 4 hours out of 24, reads and replies to his daily rain of letters, and suffers no single occurrence of the least interest in parts of the world to escape his attention. I could not perceive that his memory, the first mental faculty to show decay, is at all impaired. He talks rapidly with the greatest apparent case, never hesitating for a word, whether in English or German, and in fact seemed to be unconscious in which language he was using as he changed 5 or 6 times in the course of the conversation. He did not remain in his chair for more than 10 minutes at a time, frequently getting up and walking about the room, now and then pointing to a picture or opening a book to illustrate some remark. He began by referring to my winter journey into Lapland. Why do you choose the winter? He asked. Your experience will be very interesting, it is true, but will you not suffer from the severe cold? That remains to be seen, I answered. I have tried all climates except the Arctic without the least injury. The last 2 years of my travels were spent in tropical countries, and now I wish to have the strongest possible contrast. That is quite natural, he remarked, and I can understand how your object in travel must lead you to seek such contrast. But you must possess a remarkably healthy organization. You doubtless know from your own experience, I said, that nothing preserves a man's vitality like travel. Very true, he answered. If it does not kill at the outset, for my part, I keep my health everywhere, like yourself. During 5 years in South America and the West Indies, I passed through the midst of black vomit and yellow fever untouched. I spoke of my projected visit to Russia and my desire to traverse the Russian Tatar provinces of Central Asia. The Kyrgyz steppes, he said, were very monotonous. 50 miles gave you the picture of 1,000, but the people who were exceedingly interesting. If I do desire to go there, I would have no difficulty in passing through them to the Chinese frontier. But the southern provinces of Siberia, he thought, would be best repay me. The scenery among the Altai mountains were very grand. From his window in one of his Siberian towns, he had counted 11 peaks covered with eternal snow. The Kyrgyz, he added, were among the few races whose habits had remained unchanged for thousands of years, and they had the remarkable peculiarity of combining a monastic and nomadic life. They were partly Buddhist, partly Muslim, and their monkish sects following the different clans in their wanderings, carrying on their devotions in their encampments inside of a covered circle marked out by spears. He had seen the ceremonies and was struck by the resemblance to that of the Catholic Church. Humboldt's recollections of the Altai Mountains naturally led him to speak of the Andes. You have traveled in Mexico, said he. Do you not agree with me in that opinion that the finest mountains in the world are those of the single cones of perpetual snow rising out of the splendid vegetation of the tropics? The Himalayas, although loftier, can scarcely make an equal impression. They lie further to the south, without the belt of tropical growths, and their sides are dreary and sterile in comparison. You remember Orizaba? Continued he. Here is an engraving from a rude sketch of mine. I hope you will find it correct. He rose and took it down from the illustrated photo which accompanied the last edition of his minor writings, turned over the leaves and recalled at each plate some reminiscence of his American travel. I still think, he remarked as he closed the book, that Chimborazo is the grandest mountain in the world.